fear Brazil is sleepwalking into a totalitarian police state. Despite strong assertions made by the Brazilian government, I have not found the level of evidence required to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that Jair Bolsonaro or anyone around him is actually guilty of any crimes whatsoever. I keep searching and continue to come up short of clear evidence of real guilt. My question is, how does anyone know that Jair Bolsonaro has committed all of these crimes with relation to this supposed coup d'etat against the Lula government? What is the evidence and what does it say? And how do we know the evidence presented was not fabricated by the Brazilian government or federal police forces? As the free people of Earth, how do we really know for certain if Bolsonaro and his alleged co-conspirators are guilty of anything, legally or morally? These are the central questions I've sought answers to and continue to seek answers to. Brazilian politics and government have never really been free from corruption or political webs of intrigue. Of course, in close contentious cases such as these, it can be quite difficult to judge crimes from a distance, separated from the quantum of physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, which is why it is so alarming to me that Americans or Brazilians or anyone could make rash, whimsical statements on matters of grave public concern. For example, making fun of Jair Bolsonaro desperately trying to force his way out of an ankle monitor. Almost all members of the public not directly involved in the case certainly do not have the time to study subjects like these with a careful enough review to actually get to the bottom of the truth or do justice to the facts of the case, one way or another, in complicated and detailed matters such as these with so much hanging in the balance. Certainly, a cursory scan of newspaper headlines does not suffice. Finding the truth requires careful and prolonged consideration and careful, incontroversial, divisive, high-profile cases. It requires dodging around the many ephemeral impressions beaming forth from the bright lights of the information industrial complex that fight for your attention and emotional energy. Underlying assumptions must be challenged through a protracted dialectical model. Anything less, and you will end up with a worldview that is equivalent in value to a ticking time bomb. If there are any English versions of Jair Bolsonaro's indictments or conviction, anyone is welcome to direct me to those or send them to me. Obviously, if what the prosecution and Supreme Court say is true, then what the Bolsonaro bloc did is indeed very bad. But if the prosecution or Supreme Court are lying or deceiving the public, well, then you have a much bigger problem on your hands, people of Brazil. A much, much bigger problem. And if you do have that problem, you'd better wake up quick if you care at all about escaping through that elusive passageway towards human freedom. Shockingly, the Supreme Federal Court in Brazil not only convicted Bolsonaro, but it convicted 33 others who were allegedly involved in a far-reaching and ambitious conspiracy theory to overthrow the civil government. Bolsonaro's fellow no-goodniks are also getting decades in the slammer, upwards of 20 or 30 years, as if they had actually robbed a bank or tried to kill someone. The U.S. law on insurrection, Title 18 U.S.C. Section 2383, for example, limits its sentence to not more than 10 years in prison. This heavy-handed approach by Brazil's highest court indicates judicial bias when you realize no actions were really taken by Bolsonaro. Putting someone in jail for 30 years is a very serious action and merits very serious evidence. It all feels rather too whimsical based on the prosecution's foundational case. Bolsonaro, if nothing changes, will die in prison while still suffering from his stabbing wounds inflicted in 2018. The idea that the Bolsonaro camp was going to poison Silva and kill a bunch of other high-level officials to prevent a transfer of power seems completely laughable. They would totally lose public support and expose themselves as tyrants. That is simply not believable to me. In reality, Bolsonaro did follow the rules of Brazil's constitution, and from what I have seen, did so orderly despite what I see as clearly unanswered election questions in that country. If this is this the main thrust of the prosecution's case? The dissenting judge on the Supreme Federal Court, Fuchs, basically said Bolsonaro was being convicted of a thought crime, which is one of the hallmarks of George Orwell's famous dystopian novel 1984. The infamous green and yellow dagger plan was a Word document. Is that correct? Did I read that right? See, that's weird to me. How do you demonstrate a clear chain of custody on a Word document? It just doesn't make any sense to me. I want to know how that document was authenticated in Brazilian court of law. And how do we know that Bolsonaro touched that document? How do we know he knew about that document? How do we know the document wasn't planted? Prosecutors had alleged that the coup plot began in 2021 with efforts to quote-unquote undermine public trust in the electoral system. And that is a CNN citation. This is where a big red alarm bell starts going off in my head. What about you? Even a reasonable trial could identify the criminalization of inflicting a loss of public trust in societal institutions as a naked Orwellian Trojan horse for totalitarianism and completely irrelevant to the commission of any meaningful crime. If the public determines or is persuaded by whomever that the government is lying about the integrity of its election systems, first of all, people have the freedom of speech to come to that conclusion if they think it to be true. And second of all, the person winning an argument to convince the public of something does not automatically make them a criminal for rightfully sowing public distrust, especially if that distrust is correctly placed. Even if a demagogue successfully creates public distrust based on falsehoods, that would still not be a criminal action unless certain forms of intentional deception were involved, such as literally fabricating documents and so forth. More germanely, distrusting the government is not a crime under natural law. In fact, it's more like a duty. It is your duty as a human patriot to distrust governments and large institutions. They have much centralized power, especially in our increasingly consolidated society. To me, these assertions completely blow up the prosecution's credibility. Completely. Complete annihilation, obliteration of credibility. Is this what this case is based upon? Interesting article from AP News. Defense lawyer says there's no evidence Brazil's Bolsonaro tried to carry out a coup. Is Bolsonaro accused of questioning the election system and wanting to investigate potential voting crimes? At the same time, Bolsonaro's defense lawyer stated there is no evidence linking Bolsonaro to the green and yellow dagger plan. And how do we really ever know the prosecution is not fabricating this evidence and planting it? How do we really know? Like scientifically, how do we really know? I look at all these media articles and they all say the same thing, and there's just not a lot of coverage on the details of this case. It's more just kind of covering the actions and conclusions of the Supreme Court. In America, this conviction would have trouble standing, I believe. I'm not a lawyer, but based on my research, I believe it would have trouble standing because there are two elements to a crime, mens rea and actus reus. It appears that there is no actus reus in Bolsonaro's case, no meaningful actus reus, and in fact he ordered a transfer of power. Even the mens rea here is questionable and debatable. Another article worth reading by Valor International, Bolsonaro attacks evidence, denies coup plot in final argument. Justice Carmen Lucia said she was convinced by the evidence the Attorney General's office presented against the former president. He is the instigator, the leader of an organization that orchestrated every possible move to maintain or seize power, keyword power. She said, notice Justice Lucia does not differentiate between rightfully and wrongfully obtained political power. I think that's an important footnote that continuously is getting lost in this case. Her argument depends on the fundamental assumption of the integral solidity of Brazilian election systems. Justice Luiz Fux, the dissenting justice, disagreed with the majority's holding and stated, "No one can be punished for cogitation," aka a thought crime, which is a word that comes from George Orwell's nightmare novel about a dystopian totalitarian future, 1984, published in 1948. No actus reus. Justice Fuchs argues that events do not constitute a coup as Lula was never overthrown. CNN citation. Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who oversaw the case, the overseer, said Bolsonaro carried out a series of acts from 2021 through January 8, 2023 that constituted the attempted coup. The actions included casting doubt on Brazil's electronic voting systems, aka freedom of speech to challenge the integrity of elections, quote-unquote drafting a decree to annul the election results, and encouraging the quote-unquote riots on January 8th, 2023. Can you show me a video of Jair Bolsonaro encouraging rioters that aim to force a military takeover, the military takeover of Brazilian citizens haphazardly vandalizing sofas on January 8th, that attempted military takeover? Where's the evidence that the federal police uncovered that Bolsonaro had plans or signed off on plans somehow to kill President Lula da Silva? How could one know these documents or pieces of evidence, electronic evidence, are not planted? How do we really know that? There may be only a handful of people on the planet who perhaps actually know the answer to that question. According to the evidence presented by the Attorney General, Bolsonaro gathered cabinet and military officials to quote-unquote discuss an emergency decree, to discuss an emergency decree that quote-unquote would have suspended the election results in order to quote-unquote investigate quote-unquote unproven electoral fraud claims. This sounds to me like scenario planning, wargaming, and again, if the fraud claims turn out to be right, then it would have been Bolsonaro's duty to investigate and prosecute people who committed election crimes. So that would have been the moral thing to do. Federal police said Bolsonaro had full knowledge of a quote-unquote a plan, quote-unquote, to overturn the election results, pressure the military to quote-unquote intervene, and even create a parallel crisis management office to run the government. The term overturn here is subjectively used and based on the assumption that the election results were an accurate reflection of the voice of Brazilian voters. Again, note the lack of distinction between rightful and wrongful transfer of power, similar to omissions and miscontextualizations made by national politicians in America with regard to the 2020 general election and the ensuing chaos and skepticism. Culminating, of course, in the January 6th event raiding of the Capitol. Bolsonaro's former military aides have testified that he had planned to ask for military intervention in case he lost the elections. Is ask the same as order? That is my question. Not that he did, but that he planned to. So again, what is the actus reus here? And also, what type of military intervention? An investigative military intervention? Are they going to redo the election if they found something? Or perhaps, if the media and the Supreme Court is right, in the negative against my skepticism, that a straight military intervention to overthrow the democratic results of the election, which I am highly skeptical of, based on what I've read. And an intervention on what grounds, on what evidence? And also, what if the election results were corrupt? Then it would be a crime to transfer power to the person who stole the election, if it was stolen. Lastly, just to add, this is the same Jair Bolsonaro who was stabbed in 2018. Typically, it is the good guys who get stabbed by the bad guys, especially at high levels in politics, unless a false flag is staged, of course. You never know. Bolsonaro has stated that he believes he knows who is responsible for this stabbing. This case with Bolsonaro sets a bad precedent for people who democratically challenge and question elections and the results of elections. I think about the Bush v. Gore debacle in 2000 here in America, and the charges are clearly not narrow enough in this case, and they've charged Bolsonaro with a couple of charges that are absolutely nonsense. Turning to January 8th now, where's the evidence linking Bolsonaro to the January 8th unrest/riots? That is not clear. I've reviewed some videos of the January 8th storming of the Brazilian government buildings. I see no evidence that Jair Bolsonaro was involved in that in any way. If anyone has further information, feel free to send that to me. Furthermore, there were many Brazilian citizens there protesting what they thought was a corrupt election. Some individuals destroyed property and vandalized government buildings. Yes, those individuals would then be held responsible for those actions. Rightfully so. It's my understanding that the government was not in session or present during that political riot. How could they then all be charged with being connected to attempting to overturn the allegedly democratically elected government in Brazil? Who were they there to hurt? The furniture, break a couple windows, put some graffiti on the walls. The prosecution says this mob attack was the coup's final death throes attempt to wrest power from Brazil's democratic institutions. Bolsonaro himself was in a Florida Publix while the riots were ongoing. To me, that almost feels like he was intentionally saying, hey man, I'm not involved in this any way whatsoever. Perhaps he thought or knew there were agent provocateurs in the Brasilia crowds, a setup brewing perhaps, seeing what happened in America in 2021. Many of Bolsonaro's supporters have also condemned this form of civil unrest, and it looks like not everyone there at the government buildings were engaging in vandalism. However, it remains true, as Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, that it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government and institute a new government if the old one is corrupt or not serving the interests of the public. These are very delicate and complex matters. Very delicate and complex. CNN citation in January 2023, quote, Bolsonaro shared a Facebook video of a woman questioning the victory of Lula Silva, who defeated Bolsonaro in the October presidential election. The video was then deleted a few hours later. Prosecutors say although the video was posted after the attacks, there is a connection between the content in Bolsonaro's video and the violence in Brasilia. This is what is linking Bolsonaro to January 8th. Folks, this is what a totalitarian police state looks like. It's Silva, it's de Moraes, it's the Supreme Court, it's the federal police, it's the prosecutors, it's the Brazilian election system and whoever runs it. In a speech that lasted more than 13 hours explaining his dissenting vote, Justice Fuchs said that there was not enough evidence to convict the far-right leader and that he was not responsible for the January 8th attack on government buildings. And that is a time media, Time magazine news citation. After Bolsonaro's defeat in the 2022 election, prosecutors said defendants attempted to overturn the results by encouraging Bolsonaro supporters to mobilize, quote-unquote mobilize, in Brasilia, where they stormed and vandalized the 3 seats of government on January 8th, 2023. That is a CNN citation. And my question is, mobilize to do what? Protest? Beat up the sofas? CNN does not say. Ultimately, a group of people who may or may not have been infiltrated by agent provocateurs vandalized government buildings, that much is clear. But how is a disorganized mob of pissed off Brazilians, a mob of individual pissed off Brazilians going to overthrow the Brazilian government through vandalization? Can someone please explain to me how this makes any sense at all? It makes no sense unless it's all a bunch of lies. Separate from Bolsonaro are the people initiating the prosecution. Here's how worthless and corrupt Brazilian federal police are. The same group that later recommended charges against Bolsonaro for the alleged coup d'etat. They indicted him with falsifying his COVID-19 vaccination status. First of all, that's Bolsonaro's private medical information. Second of all, the federal police investigation is emblematic of COVID-19 era medical authoritarianism and public health coercion, ultimately constituting a violation of the spirit of the Nuremberg Code and the 2005 UNESCO Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, Article 6, requiring Bolsonaro to provide COVID-19 vaccine papers as a gross violation of his individual informed consent rights. It's tyranny in the first place, obviously, to request these papers. To criminally investigate someone for exercising their informed consent rights to be free from medical coercion and tyranny is blatantly Orwellian and completely immoral. The Brazilian federal police are an abomination. They turn around and try to put Bolsonaro in jail for avoiding the COVID-19 vaccine. This is just an absolute abomination upon the face of humanity and upon the face of the earth. And that is my case in point. Totalitarianism right there, staring us right in the face. Turning to Alexandre de Moraes, he is no angel himself. In fact, if I were to cast a totalitarian-looking demon monster man as a world dictator in a Kafkaesque horror film, I would choose exactly him. He looks like a bald-headed, flesh-eating, demonic space alien to me. Central casting. Elon Musk has criticized de Moraes as being very aggressively in favor of censorship. Not very democratic of him, is it? Even blocking Brazilians from accessing Twitter/X at one point during a legal skirmish between X and the Brazilian High Court. That is very extreme. Moraes has also politically clashed with a number of prominent American media companies over disagreements about what constitutes misinformation and disinformation. In all seriousness, Moraes is a strong state actor with clear authoritarian tendencies. His anti-free speech, judicial activism exposes him as ideologically anti-democratic. In fact, what hypocrisy coming from someone accusing Bolsonaro of being this anti-democratic big bad wolf. De Moraes needs to look in the mirror. Separately, I will add de Moraes is extremely uninformed about American political history. He has said America has never had a coup before. Wrong. We've had multiple coup attempts in America, and one very important and successful one that occurred on November 22nd, 1963. Next up, Brazil's President Lula Silva is a Fabian socialist, and Jacobin magazine is quite fond of him and hosts many of his speeches on their website. Character Lula has a murky history. He has been accused of being at the center of a massive corruption scandal involving kickbacks surrounding Brazil's largest energy company, Petrobras. He has also been to federal prison in Brazil. Another president from his party, that same party, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached for manipulation of government records. And those weren't COVID-19 vaccination status records, ladies and gentlemen. President Rousseff and Lula have long histories and close connections even to the Communist Party of Brazil. Very interesting. Communist ideologues like Trotsky and Stalin and others have been known for living up to the Machiavellian credo of the end justifies the means. One would perhaps not be surprised if the election systems in Brazil are fatally rigged, with such serious forces steeped in Brazil. Would that really surprise anyone? There might be foul play in Brazilian election systems. Brazil's own citizens have accused Silva of being a communist. He certainly is a self-proclaimed socialist. German newspaper DW ran a piece in 2022 trying to make Lula out to be more centrist than he really is, and instead, in the same article, confirmed his Fabian socialist tendencies. And here I want to put in a brief footnote that socialism typically takes the form and evolves into fascism, also known as oligarchical collectivism, because a central government directs and plans economic, social, and political developments instead of the creative destruction of entrepreneurship and self-government from the bottom up. Free market capitalism allows innovation, advancement, and is supposed to allow workers to become their own shopkeepers when that system is designed correctly, which in turn allows workers to compete in free markets for profits to support their families. That competition pushes society forward to deliver better lives for everyone. In contrast, again, socialism tends towards a centralized power structure with control and direction from the top, controlled by special interests. Community ownership of the means of production typically equates to omniscient government or gang control. Again, free market capitalism best empowers workers to start their own businesses and enjoy the fruits of their own labor. And we want to train entrepreneurs in the education system, not employees or corporate wage slaves, which is what is currently going on with the Rockefeller-Carnegie model of enslavement. Also, the objectives of Fabian socialism are identical to that of communism, only its means are different. Coming back to the matter at hand, Brazilians who voted for Silva against Bolsonaro and celebrated his win and say Silva is this great guy are no doubt foolish. If they say Bolsonaro is a criminal, then Silva is also a criminal. That's the bottom line. What you need in Brazil is the decentralization of political power away from Brasilia and the empowerment of local communities and citizens to take charge of their own lives without the interference of criminals in charge of your national government. Almost half of Brazil doesn't believe in the results of the Bolsonaro trial. In fact, The Conversation, which is a news outlet, and Why Brazilians Have Been So Divided in Their Reaction to Bolsonaro's Conviction, reported in September/August of 2025, where a new presidential election held Bolsonaro would win by about 0.8 percentage points over Lula Silva. That's a very close race. There have been many protests and many counter-protests. The people of Brazil do not agree in this case or the state of Brazilian national politics and public affairs. That's worth keeping in mind. It's not like Brazilians are all on the same page here. Just like in America, we're not all on the same page. There's not an agreement, yet one side is being sentenced to decades in prison. This looks like mob rule. This does not mean I'm saying Bolsonaro is not guilty, but it means something major is going on in Brazil, one way or the other. That is a very heavy-handed sentence, muddied by such national controversy. Now, Bolsonaro's own words. Under the pretext of defending democracy, the pillars of democracy were broken to condemn an innocent person who dared not bow to a dictator named Alexandre de Moraes. This is definitely and certainly not the one-sided story Lula supporters make it out to be. It sounds like a number of prominent politicians in Brazil, including the governor of Sao Paulo, Tarcísio, have criticized the Bolsonaro imprisonment as unjust and disproportionate and are calling for amnesty. Brazil is very divided like in the U.S. It's difficult to know for certain what the truth is, but lots of people have lots of opinions that they like to talk about without thinking too much about it, and even celebrate Bolsonaro getting thrown into prison. That is so sad. Even if they're right, that is so sad. Even if they're right, are we really going to celebrate something like this? People who celebrate assassinations, like Charlie Kirk, and political opponents getting thrown into prison for decades are the problem. They are the brown shirts. They are the fascists. The most essential underlying question to this whole saga is that question: was Brazil's election legitimate? Because if it was not, then Silva, the federal police, the Supreme Court, and the voting machine companies would be guilty of overthrowing the government, not Bolsonaro. So a person must know for certain that the election outcome was an accurate reflection of the voice of the Brazilian people as decided on election day 2022. Bolsonaro's party filed legal actions to invalidate votes from electronic voting machines which lacked ID numbers. Why did the Brazilian government fine Bolsonaro's Liberal Party for bringing this legal action? For merely bringing it? What, they don't want to look at any evidence? They don't want to investigate anything? They don't want to turn up any stones? Do they want to look the other way while election corruption persists in Brazil? Does not make any sense to me. Unless it's all super corrupt and evil, then it makes perfect sense. Here's an MSN article. Lula struggles to blunt Bolsonaro rise in tight Brazil race. 61% of Brazilians rate corruption as country's biggest concern. The Socialist Workers' Party public approval rating allegedly plunged from 90% down to 8% in a very short time period directly prior to Bolsonaro's successful election in 2018. Is the Workers' Party that much back in popular swing a mere 3 years later? The 2022 presidential election in Brazil was quite close, within 1.8 percentage points after Bolsonaro won in 2018 by 11 percentage points. Lula Silva, on the other hand, has been running for Brazilian president since 1989, a whopping 36 years. That is longer than the period of military dictatorship in Brazil, which lasted 21 years. Indeed, PBS has reported that polls show Bolsonaro would be a competitive candidate in next year's vote if allowed to run. This means that half of Brazil does not trust its government, its judicial branch, and does not believe its own Supreme Court acted justly in convicting Bolsonaro and his entourage, does it not? Brazil compared to America. The idea promoted by Brazilian officials and media that electronic voting machines cannot be tampered with is not true and essentially laughable. Multiple very strong documentaries have been released in the United States interviewing computer scientists from major universities citing major technical flaws in these machines. One of these documentaries goes by the name of Kill Chain, and a lot of national politicians and politicians from the Democratic Party were also interviewed as part of this documentary, admitting to vulnerabilities in these systems. Politicians and leaders from both parties, including Kamala Harris in America, are on record being aware about this problem, but many of them like to pretend it does not exist when it does not politically favor them, and almost no one wants to do anything about it. My question is, why? What is happening in Brazil appears very similar to what has transpired in the United States, which was and still is extremely controversial. It is because the truth is hard to determine and involves many people and ephemeral events. The January 6th incident is reflective of decades-long festering corruption at the highest levels of government and Americans' distrust in official institutions and leaders to tell them the truth. The intrigue is deeper than what most people in the public can even imagine. Many Americans far away from flashy news cameras and fancy government hallways are extremely concerned about the widespread corruption in our public institutions and leaders. Hypocrisy and corruption pervade all levels of government throughout the United States, except for perhaps a small number of rural communities and maybe even a couple states at most. Layered on top of the pervasive corruption that is present is a naive moral nearsightedness at play in everyday people and lower-level public sector workers who are ignorant or have no problem with being taken advantage of if it means they don't get called mean or rude. And everyone suffers as a result of the persistence of governmental misconduct just because no one wants to confront bad actors and be mean or be in bad taste or go against the culture or create a ruckus. Being tough is frowned upon as domestic terrorism or bigotry. And when societal degeneration violates no laws, there is an impersonal, collective force that attacks the social and cultural underpinnings of America's founding generation and ideas indirectly. There are many problems with the world's so-called leader in democracy. 95+% of Americans are not publicly engaged or informed on subjects they need to be informed about. They care more about the World Series or the Final Four. In turn, a vacuum of special interests who are dedicated to political results come in. They manipulate, they deceive, they seize power. Laws get created, and the people are further separated from the government, just as General George Washington warned us about in his private letters in the 1790s. January 6th in America was intended to be a demonstration to impel Congress to investigate the results of the 2020 general election for fraud or misconduct. That was its essential purpose and intention. Now go back and rewind the tape. Did you see any counter-protesters there? Any federal agents in the crowd? No, not really. It is highly likely that some were dressed up, posing as Trump supporters and similar people and help people fight police and maybe even break into the Capitol. Who knows? Some of that leaked out in the news, and all that nonsense takes away from real stories like mine about how my absentee ballot in 2020 went missing, or the electioneering I personally witnessed in 2022, or the suspicious, highly suspicious behavior from all three levels of government in Minnesota that I witnessed as a on-duty election judge in 2024. Following his own dubious legal fight surrounding the equally dubious 2020 general election, the 47th President of the United States has expressed concern for Bolsonaro's treatment. More importantly, pay attention now. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, very interestingly, who is very ideologically different than the United States President in a number of key ways. And by the way, Rubio was unanimously confirmed into office by a 99-0 Senate vote, which includes all Democrats, somehow, has stated the political persecutions by sanctioned human rights abuser Alexandre de Moraes continue as he and others on Brazil's Supreme Court have unjustly ruled to imprison former President Jair Bolsonaro. The United States will respond accordingly to this witch hunt. He called it a witch hunt. The U.S. has imposed some serious sanctions on de Moraes and other Brazilian officials. Secretary Rubio is a licensed attorney, obviously, by training, and went to the University of Miami. In addition, Bolsonaro's intelligence chief fled to the United States. There are reports of him being in Miami He was in ICE custody. His allies said that he was released, so that he's not in ICE detention anymore and has a pending asylum claim. So at the time of making this video, about mid-May of 2026, officials in the United States State Department are in no hurry to extradite Ramajem, or Brazil spy chief, back to Brazil to face the 16 years that he was sentenced to with Bolsonaro. My experience about elections. I have personally experienced issues with America's so-called brilliant democracy firsthand as an official election judge in the state of Minnesota. I have very seriously considered bringing a pro se petition for declaratory judgment against all three levels of government in Minnesota, state, county, and local, for acting irresponsibly and inappropriately. All three levels of government in Minnesota conspired to contravene my sacred oath as an election judge under statutory law, to diligently endeavor to prevent misconduct and fraud. They fired me for bringing up the idea that a cooperative effort from both Democrat and Republican judges could be made to audit the vote counts more carefully. They fired me damn quick too, within minutes of learning about my calls for greater transparency. If I would have showed up to the polling place, perhaps to complain or confront the other judges and individuals involved, they probably would have called the police and had me arrested. Can't have anybody looking around and counting votes in America. It's not like this is a democracy after all. I advocated for a team approach to counting votes in alignment with statutory law, and the bureaucrats running the election fired me. So much for counting votes and democracy in America. Nobody cares about democracy. America's not a democracy. Why does Unliberty, Dominion voting systems, and other electronic voting machine companies have more access and control to counting votes and overseeing the election process than I do, an American citizen and duly appointed election judge? Obviously, this is extremely serious. This is not a joke to me. I am absolutely angry about this to this day. I'm very concerned for my country, America, for Brazil, Brazil's people, and all of humanity. On top of all these problems, you have an education system in America, which is its own form of election interference and truly an abomination. Younger generations of Americans are being targeted with serious indoctrination and miscontextualizations of historical records, which impacts how these younger generations participate at all levels across this country. And they say America's supposedly the leader in free elections in this world. If that's the case, we are in deep trouble. It is so corrupt and bad in America, and no one says anything. We act like everything is normal. The electronic voting machines cannot be trusted. If nothing else, as a matter of principle, human beings who want democracy must take responsibility for their own democratic processes, even given the fact that America was designed as a constitutional republic. We as citizens cannot outsource our most important responsibilities to robots and machines. Conclusion. Bolsonaro questioned the integrity of Brazilian elections. Is that what makes him a domestic terrorist? Is that what makes him a traitor? Is that what makes him fit for lifelong imprisonment? I would say there are too many unanswered questions to convict Bolsonaro in my mind, given what has been presented. However, the more I research this issue, the more it looks like a nation spiraling out of control and whirling into a totalitarian police state dystopian hell that wants to hurt its own citizens, destroy the national election system, silence dissent, imprison political opposition that challenges it or seeks the truth about public corruption. Only God knows what else. As a people who allegedly care about truth, justice, freedom, anti-corruption, it would be foolish to cheerlead the arrest, conviction, and imprisonment of any national politician, really, especially without a provable actus reus. This is no game. It's not a television show. This type of attitude is very childish, inappropriate, bloodthirsty, will probably get us all killed, or worse. It's very vengeful. There's an energy of evil that lurks amongst us. I am frankly not convinced about anything except for the fact that I would not even trust Alexandre de Moraes with the management of a neighborhood taco stand. I would avoid buying tacos from there myself. Based on what I've read on this case thus far, the people who need to go to jail are de Moraes and the corrupt individuals in the Brazilian Federal Police. Based on the publicly available information in English I have read, I do not currently accept the conclusion that Jair Bolsonaro has committed criminal actions with relation to a supposed attempted coup. I quit and await for the sufficient proofs to be brought forth. And yet still, there are fools who laugh about how funny it is that Jair Bolsonaro tried and failed to wiggle his way out of an ankle monitor. Just remember, it's coming for you next. You fools. Just remember that you have made this bed in which you sleep. The free people of the world must carefully and correctly identify, expose, and guard against the duplicitous and nefarious machinations of crescendoing institutionalized power before that power forever douses the yearning spirit of liberty amongst us. Once a country or region becomes overwhelmed by tyranny, it does not very often slide back from that point of no return. This is the archetype of the Venus flytrap, and Brazil is inside the Venus flytrap. Briefly departing from the central point of this video, I want to take a brief moment now to balance the scales and express my concern regarding the deforestation of the Amazon and the loss of biodiversity. Reserving my right to change my position, it is universally reported that environmental degradation and deforestation of the Amazon rainforest has accelerated under the Bolsonaro administration. Bolsonaro is well known for complaining about how environmentalism in Brazil has blocked economic development in the region. My concern is that once we lose the biodiversity and natural habitats in the Amazon, we may never get them back, and that may be its own point of no return. That scares me. The Amazon, I think, has a multi-dimensional value that is in some ways inexplicable and in other ways elusive. But as humanity, we need to grow to understand the importance of preserving that genetic information and lived experiences. The way I see it, the Bolsonaro family and the Brazilian Liberal Party need to step up and grow to the point where they understand the necessity of preserving the biodiversity and natural land of the Amazon. It is such a beautiful forest, and we want to burn it down and turn it into a cattle grazing operation and plant fields of GMO Monsanto corn. This is so sad to me. Please do not do this. Brazil can exercise its sovereignty and still be a Christian steward of God's creation to protect the biodiversity that exists in that land. It doesn't have to be a false dichotomy. And another question I have, why can't economic development happen in other regions in Brazil? Why does it have to be the Amazon? Those are my questions. Conservatives in America have a similar issue, but still value conservation. Our equivalent in America to this issue is something like ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which now the Trump administration wants to drill for oil. I don't want to sit here and criticize Brazil without looking at America first. That's its own subject, its own video. We need to be extremely careful about how we preserve or destroy the genetic libraries of Earth. There are grave consequences in the destruction of these libraries. We must be more careful. Will we deplete and destroy Earth in our nationalistic quest for geopolitical hegemony or material riches? The question I want everyone to ask themselves is, but what is it that we lose along the way? This obviously underscores the importance of the censorship of alternative energy technologies which we know exist. If any factual corrections are requisite for the accuracy of this report, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much for your time, attention, and commitment to seek the truth, wherever it may lead. My name is Sam Alexander, and if you need me, you can find me at worldwideandbeyond.com.